This is Ralph Cinque. I went to Dealey Plaza to authenticate the freeway sign in the Zapruder film. As you know, it looms very large in the film. You can see it here at the very top of the intersection. It covers up the shot which supposedly went through Kennedy and Connally, causing 7 wounds in 2 men. Very conveniently, it covered that up. So is it real? I went there with a surrogate sign. I placed it in the right position at the right angle, and I reshot the Zapruder film. But first, let's notice that in this case, the sign looms very early. I want you to notice that when we see the entire sign, we can also see the entire fort across the street where we see the corner and it changes direction. So I want you to note that because I want you to compare it to what I captured. And then in the next frame, you're going to see that Kennedy has his hand over his face. Did he really do that? No, I'm sure he didn't. They did that, and they wanted to cover up his face. I'll explain why later. Just note that they did that. And then finally, after that, he emerges from behind the sign. He's raising his hands to his mouth because his airway is blocked and he needs to address it. And now we are going to look at what I captured when I shot the Zapruder film. The first one uses a real movie camera. Notice that when it gets to that corner of the wall, no sign. Where's the sign? There's the sign. Now that sign isn't quite big enough. It isn't quite tall enough, but mostly it's just too narrow. It needed to be twice as wide as that. That's 4 feet. The other sign, the real sign, was 8 feet. So I digitally added another sign. That's what it would have looked like if I came with the proper sign. It makes no difference to what I'm showing you. It does not mean that what I did was invalid. Okay, so here's another version of it, and this time you're going to see a car passing, and it only momentarily blocks the view, not like what we see in the Zapruder film. Finally, there's one more version that I took with my cell phone, which is a little closer up, and here he comes, and boom. Okay, so they faked this. Now we know what it really looked like, but why did they do it? They did it because they wanted to change the story of the Zapruder film. They wanted to make it that he reached the sign not having been hit, with all being well, and then that everything happened behind the sign, and that is not what happened. What really happened is that he was shot in the back very high on the hill when he was adjacent to the book depository, and he wasn't shot in the throat until later. So he rode down the hill having been shot only in the back and not in the throat. We can see it in the Croft photo. He's been shot here. They put a panel over his back because his jacket was disrupted, and they replaced Jackie's head entirely. They took a frame from her from a video that she did weeks later in which she went on television to thank the American people for sending cards and letters and telegrams. They flipped it horizontally. You'll see it in a moment. And that's what they used. And they needed a different photo because they needed to cover up his face. You notice that her coiffed hair is covering up his mouth. He probably had his mouth open in a startle. And notice that they closed his eye. All you see is a slit there, but you don't see his eye because his eyes probably looked very startled because he was shot in the back. But if he was shot in the back and he was riding down the hill and he wasn't really hurt that bad, why didn't he do something? Why didn't he take evasive action? Well, it's because he wasn't shot with a bullet. He was shot with an ice flechette. I'll explain in a moment. But this shows you where he was shot in the back. At the top of that red swath is where he was shot in the back. At the bottom of that red swath is where he was shot in the throat. That red swath represents the distance that he rode down the hill, having been shot only in the back, but not in the throat. But why didn't he react? It's because there were drugs in that ice bullet. It just penetrated briefly, but it immediately started dispersing chemicals. One of them was a nerve agent, a paralyzing nerve agent that put his muscles into spasm so he could not move, to lock him up. Here's Senator Frank Church holding the gun. He didn't know that was the gun that was used on Kennedy, but it was. And in a moment, you're going to see the then CIA Director, William Colby. And he admitted that that gun could fire paralytic shellfish toxin into a person. It was before his time. The program expired, he said, about 1970, and this was 1975. So he wasn't responsible. but he knew about it. But why should you believe me? Well, here's why you should believe me. Because here you're looking at a man who is in a seizure. He is in a state of seizure. His muscles are in spasm and he can't release it. He can't put them down. He can't do anything about it. Jackie is trying to coax him to put his arms down, but she can't help him. The spasming only spreads. There, his arms are in spasm, but in a moment you're going to see that the spasm spreads to his back, to his shoulders. Now he's hunching severely. So this is worse than it was before. And then it gets worse yet, where he retreats into a totally internalized state where he is apparently in pain. He is completely absorbed in the events that are going on inside his body. His mind is completely, totally out of it. He is numb. He is in pain here. And in a moment, he is going to be hit in the right temple from behind the fence on the grassy knoll. And that's going to put the lights out. He's going to be dead from the moment that shot hits him. It's going to just be boom, and he's gone. It'll take 20 minutes or so for his body to finish discharging. Even a chicken will run around a little bit after its head is chopped off, but it's already dead. And likewise, Kennedy was already dead from the moment that shot hit him. He was gone. A third of his brain was blown out of his skull. So, yeah, he was dead. But at this point in time, how can we sum this up? Well, Kennedy was shot with an ice flechette that contained these drugs, and this ice flechette was formulated to burst as soon as it penetrated him, and you can do that with ice. It's basically a very fragile substance. And once it ruptured inside of his muscle and fascia, it dispersed the chemicals into his bloodstream very, very rapidly. But, as William Colby told us, all it felt like was a mosquito bite. It was very light. It was just a little flicker that he would have felt in his back. So he didn't know that he was shot with a gun. All he knew is that he just felt a little twitch back there, and then he started feeling very strange, physically and mentally, where his focus, his concentration, his cognition all began failing him. And he began feeling all this tension in his body as his muscles started seizing up. He didn't know what was happening. Jackie said that she turned and looked at her husband, and she saw that he had a quizzical look on his face. She could have also said that he looked confused, that he looked bewildered, that he looked baffled. Any of those adjectives would have worked there. But that's the state that he was in as he was riding down the hill. He stopped smiling. He stopped waving. We can see that in the Betzner photo and in the Willis frame, which was taken right before the throat shot. He wasn't waving anymore. Jackie wasn't waving anymore. She had turned. She was looking at him instead of working the crowd on her side of the street. So he was already stricken, and it was then that he was shot in the throat. So the back shot came first. He rode down the hill that way, and then he was shot in the throat. They had to cover that up in the Zapruder film because they wanted the story to be that he wasn't shot at all until the throat shot, which started in his back, according to them. So in order to create that story, they had to do a lot of altering of the Zapruder film. It's just amazing what they did to it. And a big part of it was adding that phony sign that helped them to shorten the film, to shorten the distance that it took to get to the sign, and to obscure the shot completely so that it appeared that he was okay until he reached the sign. Now, what I showed you before about the fact that he put his hand over his face before he disappeared behind the sign, I don't believe anybody saw that before me. Most people just never looked at it that close, and so the assumption always was that nothing bad happened until he disappeared behind the sign. But if you look closely and you see that Jackie is already turned and looking at him, and he's got his hand supposedly over his face. That was frame 207. Basically, things start going wrong right around frame 200 is when he's no longer waving, and they start morphing his hand into that screen that's going to cover up his face. So this discovery that the freeway sign in the Zapruder film is phony is, I'm sure, the most important discovery about the JFK assassination in the 21st century. And as we approach the 60th anniversary, which is going to be this November, I think that this discovery should lead the way in the demand for JFK truth. So please share it with as many people as you can. Thank you.